Hi, and welcome to Greenhouse Educators Training. The topic for this presentation is Good Agricultural Practices, or GAP. My name is Bryan Brady, and I'm an Agriculture Extension Associate with the Food Connection in the College of Agriculture, Food, and the Environment at UK. So, what are good agricultural practices? They actually have quite a few different meanings, but in this case, when we're talking about produce, we're talking about food safety. They are guidelines to help reduce or prevent food safety hazards and the production of fresh produce, particularly produce that's eaten raw. Um, those food safety hazards can be chemical, they can be biological, or they can be physical. Chemical would be something along the lines of inappropriately mixed pesticides or fertilizers or any kind of foliar treatment. Physical would be something like broken glass, shard of metal, jewelry that broke and got into the product. And then biological hazards is mostly what we're focusing on here, particularly human pathogens, things like E. coli, salmonella, listeria, etc. So the most common GAP topics or categories are, in particular here, that are greenhouse specific, encompass water quality and how it's used. This is both pre and post harvest. When we're talking about pre harvest, we're also talking about harvest if there's any water that's used during harvest, but we're not just talking about irrigation there. We're talking about any kind of foliar application, like we just mentioned. Post harvest is anything along the lines of washing, cooling, things of that nature. We're talking about land use. Yes, you are in a controlled environment in a greenhouse, but what was that land used for before? What has the surrounding land been used for? Things like that. And we'll get into that a little bit more. Worker health, hygiene, and training. Pest control. We're not talking about insects there. We're talking about any sort of animal that might get in to the greenhouse. Harvest and packing activities, sanitation and post-harvest handling, storage and transportation, and then finally traceability. So let's start with water. Pre-harvest water and post-harvest water, again, is how we separate agricultural water in the food safety world. To talk about irrigation, we're going to talk about it in a risk assessment form from low risk to high risk. So the type of irrigation matters. There are not a lot of high risk irrigation methods in greenhouse or greenhouse use. But the irrigation methods in which the edible portion of the crop is not contacted is always going to be the lowest risk. So something along the lines of drip, wicking, NFT, or even deep water raft, things where the water is only touching the root system. Something like misting, however, carries along a higher risk because you are potentially contacting the edible portion of the crop with that water. The source of that water plays a huge role. In greenhouse production, we're typically looking at municipal or city water, which is always going to be considered the safest. It is treated to reach the federal threshold for potable water. Ground or well water can also be potable or near potable and be safe for the production of produce, but it needs to be tested. And then surface water, generally nobody's pulling from a stream or a river to irrigate in a greenhouse. However, some folks do have ground or well water that they pump into a retaining pond before they pump it into the greenhouse. And that is a higher risk because for a certain amount of time, that water is exposed to the environment, it's exposed to animals, it's exposed to potential human pathogens. And so if that's the case and that water is held in a retaining pond, then that water needs to be treated with a sanitizer if it's going to come into contact with the edible portion of the crop. And again, foliar applications, anything like fertilizers or pesticides are contacting probably the edible portion of the crop, so you'll have to use potable water there. Post-harvest water. In greenhouse produce production, there's not a ton of washing, especially if you're producing hydroponic greens. There's really no reason to have to wash them. You're producing still a raw agricultural product. It's kind of a buyer-driven thing. Cooling, again, not quite the same need to cool and take out field heat, even though greenhouses are controlled environments and they can be hot. They're typically not as hot as a summer field. So transportation, when we talk about post-harvest water transportation, we're talking about larger operations that may be using flumes, sending cherry tomatoes or things of that nature down flumes for packing. That's a larger operation thing. Whether or not that water is a single pass or recirculated water matters both for pre-harvest and post-harvest. Recirculated water definitely needs to be sanitized if it's going to come into contact with the edible portion of the crop. And so does single pass. But single pass water that is not going to come into that contact with the edible portion of the crop is the lowest risk there. And then, of course, cleaning and sanitizing any equipment, food contact surfaces. In that case, you're talking about the need for potable water as well. Our next topic is land use. This is not as big of a concern in production of produce as it is obviously with field operations or with high tunnels where you're growing the product in the ground. And in that case, the former land use or the history of the land use is much more of concern. Land use in this case would be, where it would be a big concern would be, like I was talking about, the retaining ponds that some operations use. Then you would be worried about, any kind of runoff. Are there livestock operations nearby? Is there a runoff risk? If you're using a retaining pond or if you're using groundwater, do you have a septic system leach field? And does that come anywhere near not just the retaining pond, but also maybe your groundwater source? And then flooding. Is your land susceptible to flooding? What's the frequency of that? Those are things that no doubt you considered before the greenhouse was constructed. But, catastrophic flooding on the level of what happened in eastern Kentucky this year is something, that some greenhouse producers are dealing with now. And being in a greenhouse, you do have the ability to get back to production a little bit quicker than anybody who had their field flooded, obviously. But it is something you depending on the height of the flooding and severity of it, could certainly affect the greenhouse. So it's something you want to be aware of, but obviously probably something that you considered before before building your greenhouse. Worker health and hygiene and training. This is one of the biggest areas in which you can improve the food safety of your product. It's also one of the biggest areas that your product is at risk. When we talk about hands, we're talking about basically having a hand washing policy. That's universal to just about any business that deals with food. If you're going to wear gloves, which is often done in greenhouses, have a clear policy about that and what it means to wear gloves, when you should take your gloves off and switch out to a new pair of gloves, because wearing gloves around food can be a false sense of security. You might do something that you wouldn't do with your bare hands with gloves on and not think about it. So sometimes, having a glove policy on when you should change your gloves can help prevent that. Illness and injury. Encourage workers, students not to work in the greenhouse when they are ill. Encourage workers and students to report injuries. Have some sort of injury procedure for treating and cleaning up afterwards. Obviously, the first thing you want to do is treat the injury. Having first aid kits available is important. After treating the injury, how do you clean up? How do you assess whether or not produce has been affected? Clothing. Obviously, clean clothes. Nothing that can become a physical hazard, like jewelry. Having a jewelry policy that says something along the lines of, okay, earrings are fine, rings are fine, maybe no dangly necklaces, things of that nature that might fall off unknowingly and contaminate the product. Some greenhouses even have hairnet policies to prevent hair from getting in the product. Footwear is another area where you might, you're unlikely to be growing anything in the ground in a greenhouse, but contaminated footwear can contaminate produce. If you think about when there's occasionally standing water in the greenhouse and you're walking around with boots, that are contaminated, you may have been in a livestock area, and that gets into that puddle, and somebody splashes that puddle later, and maybe it gets onto produce. So having some sort of footwear policy, particularly clean footwear, can be helpful. Pest control. We're not talking about insects in this case, and we're generally not talking about things that would be of an issue in other growing environments like fields or even high tunnels. The one issue that I've seen in greenhouses time and time again, even though a greenhouse is a closed and controlled environment, is rodent control. They can get in to a 1/4 inch opening. Exclusion is obviously the goal, but it can be quite difficult. So we're talking about pests here that can harbor and transmit human pathogens. Occasionally there's bird intrusion, but that's a pretty obvious one, so monitoring for bird intrusion is not really practical. Some things you can do to keep rodents interested in a building is keep the exterior of the building or greenhouse well mowed and free of debris. Any produce or vegetation should be kept off of the floor, and trash cans should be covered. Do not store your seeds in the greenhouse. Rodents love seeds, so not only keep the seeds out of the greenhouse, but make sure that you've done some monitoring before you plant a large amount of seeds. Monitor for any kind of evidence of intrusion. Obviously with rodents you're looking for feces or any kind of damage that they've done. Having some monitoring stations can be helpful. Generally these are put along the wall because rodents like to walk along the wall. They've got pretty poor eyesight, so when they feel that wall they know where they're going. Baiting with any kind of food, and generally we don't want these baited. We just want this to be a monitoring station, not an attractant, not a trap. Baiting with something like peanut butter obviously introduces a major food allergen, so we want to avoid that. The trap needs to be closed. Open traps can be unsanitary. If a mouse gets trapped in a glue station, then things can get pretty ugly when they're trying to get out of it. There are some monitoring stations now that have Wi-Fi alert, so that you don't have to have a policy of checking them every day or checking them once a week. You'll get notified if there's some sort of contact with it. And then obviously consider any kind of past observations that you've had, problems that you've had, and when you do have an intrusion, or if you do have an intrusion, try to figure out what the attractant was. So now we move on to the actual harvest of the crop that you've worked so hard to grow. Hygiene plays a major role here. We're talking about using clean and sanitized bins or any sort of thing that you harvest into. What does clean and sanitized mean? Well, it's a 3-step process. It means generally that the product is washed with soap and water. I'm usually talking about dish soap. It's scrubbed to remove any sort of visible debris or dirt. Then it's rinsed with potable water. And then after it's rinsed, it's sprayed with an appropriate sanitizer and allowed to dry. We're typically talking about bleach solution of 200 parts per million, or Sanidate or something along those lines as the sanitizer. That's a very robust system that should prevent any kind of microorganisms from living in any kind of harvest bin that you have. Again, clean hands. We've talked about that before, but clean hands. If you're wearing gloves, have a glove policy. And then if you're using any kind of harvest tools, like knives, clippers, things of that nature, they should be washed, rinsed, and sanitized after every use as well. If you are harvesting things where you're going to keep the root intact, like heads of lettuce, try to prevent water from contacting the edible portion of the crop. Just make sure that after things are harvested, they're not getting dripped on by other heads of lettuce that are being harvested. Just have a clean flow of harvest. Sanitation and post-harvest handling. All of these topics we're talking about are important, but this one is incredibly important. And the difference at this point, once you start to harvest, you enter this post-harvest, once you've harvested, you enter this post-harvest handling status. This is where you can be the one that contaminates the produce. So you need to do everything in your power to prevent that. Any sort of food contact surfaces, tables, anything that's going to come into contact with the produce needs to be smooth, non-permeable, and sanitizable. Usually you're talking about stainless steel tables or plastic tables. Any water that's used at this point must be potable, which means it meets the federal standard for drinking water. The packing area should be reasonably free of standing water, meaning that if there's standing water during washing activities, it drains quickly and away from areas where washed produce is stored, or where the the flow of traffic, where people walk through. You don't want any splashing off of the floor happening. You need the product to be protected from contamination. The big question is, what is overhead? Most packing areas are outside of the greenhouse. So in a pack shed type situation, you might have open rafters. That building might not be as enclosed as the greenhouse, so you could be talking about rodents. But with open rafters, the number one thing we see is birds that roost. The easiest way to prevent that is with some netting. And obviously all the same things that we talked about with our pest control slide, keeping areas outside of the pack shed mode, keeping trash covered, keeping any product off of the floor, or picking up product off of the floor after packing, washing, or anything like that. After that process is done, having a clean break. For any of your packing activities with your harvested product, any single-use packaging that you're using should be new. This includes bags, clamshells, boxes, all the way around. Anything that is designated as a single-use package should be brand new. Before use, that packaging should be properly stored off the ground and protected from contamination, especially anything that's cardboard. Rodents love that, and that can be seen as an attractant. Storage areas. We're typically talking about the same level of cleanliness as a packing house. Obviously, things aren't going to be happening in here like a packing house that's going to get it dirty. So, but it still needs to be cleaned and maintained in an orderly manner, free of standing water here. We don't want product that's been washed and that hasn't been properly dried to be stored here and create standing water pools in your walk-in or your refrigerator or whatever you're using to keep things cool. The product at this point really should be covered and protected. And walk-ins with condensers, you can end up getting dripping and things like that, and that could contaminate the produce. But the other advantage of covering product at this point is keeping the humidity high. And that's a quality shelf life extension thing, but it also helps keep the product food safe. If you have a temperature controlled walk-in or refrigerator or something like that, the temperature should be monitored to make sure that it's holding steady. You can decide whatever temperature you want it to be at, but you need to monitor it. And then again, I've seen rodents get into storage walk-ins as well. So excluding and monitoring for pests needs to be done here as well. Transportation. Now it's time to move your product. Whatever vehicle you're going to use to do that needs to be cleaned. It helps to have a cleaning policy so that you're making sure that it's cleaned on a regular basis. The product needs to be covered while it's being transported. It helps if it's covered inside, as well as obviously not being transported in the back of an open truck bed. You should also check the cleanliness of the vehicle, even though you might have a scheduled cleaning policy. You should check prior to loading and unloading if that vehicle is still clean. If you have a temperature controlled vehicle, then temperature should be monitored if that's the policy. The traceability of your product is a big area where you can improve food safety or response time in the very rare case that something might have to be recalled. What you need to be able to do from a traceability standpoint is trace your product one step back. Where did it come from? Where was it harvested from? And one step forward. Who was it sold to? Obviously, these seem easy, but there are some larger facilities where, it might have been harvested in Greenhouse 1 or Greenhouse 1A or something of that nature. So having some sort of system where the trace back moves along with that product wherever it goes, and then you have records to keep track of let's say Greenhouse 1 and 2 sold to this buyer, Greenhouse 3 and 4 sold to this buyer. So you should be able to reach out ahead to say, hey, we need to recall this, or you should be able to trace it back to where it was harvested. Some key information that's used in traceability procedures. If you have a large work crew, the names of the workers who harvest and pack produce can be on a label. Obviously, the field name in this case would be less likely to be field, more likely to be building name. The date of the harvest. If the date of the sale or pickup or drop-off is different from the date of the harvest, then you would also want that on the label. And then where the produce was sold to. We've got an example here on the side. It also depends on who your buyer is. If your buyer has their own labeling system, then you'll have to go by that labeling system. So we've covered most of the general topic food safety categories for greenhouses, specifically in regards to aquaponic good agricultural practices. I've worked with a couple of aquaponic facilities, and these are just basic standards. Produce cannot be grown in the same tank as fish. Basically, that irrigation water needs to be run through a filter to remove the solids, and that produce should be being grown in a separate area. Any water that comes from fish tanks and is likely to contact the edible portion of the crop must be sanitized. This is pretty rare in aquaponic situations. We're typically talking, the wastewater from the fish is going through a filter and then going into holding tanks where floats are placed on top and produce are grown, roots grow through the floats. that sort of thing. But if there's some sort of misting happening with aquaponic water, then that water needs to be sanitized and the water should be tested frequently. So since fish are cold-blooded, their feces cannot harbor human pathogens. However, there is a way for water to become contaminated through other means. So, again, testing if there's going to be any contact with the edible portion of the crop. And then you should have some sort of policy that prevents cross-contamination between fish production areas and crop production areas. Basically, a flow of traffic. If you've just worked with fish or harvested fish, what do you have to do to prevent cross-contamination with your vegetable product? So we've talked about most of the universal principles of produce food safety up until this point. Good agricultural practices are also used in a third-party audit form to provide growers with a certification that's voluntary. Let's make sure that that's key here. This is a voluntary certification. It is usually required from a buyer. This audit basically verifies that the fruits and vegetables are produced, packed, handled, stored as safely as possible. So I've worked with a couple of greenhouses and a couple of aquaponic operations to get GAP audited, and they do sell into wholesale accounts. The audit is annual, needs to be renewed each year. There are different types, and those different types come with different costs. Depending on how large your buyer is, you're usually going to go up in difficulty and up in cost. What does the typical GAP audit entail? It entails a food safety plan. Basically covers your entire operation with standard operating procedures, policies, and then records that you keep to show that you're meeting those standard operating procedures and policies that you say you're going to do. It often means implementing new procedures, policies, and record-keeping process. A lot of the things that you're probably doing in your greenhouse meet all of these food safety standards that we talked about, but now you've got to write it down if you want to have an audit. And then obviously scheduling and having an audit, and that's something that I also help growers do. What are the actual costs of a GAP audit? So the Kentucky Horticulture Council has an audit cost share that covers up to 75% of the cost of the audit. As long as you're a Kentucky Proud member, you can apply for that. It's a non-competitive cost share. If you apply for it and you don't get GAP audited that year, there's no penalty. So the average cost of our farms that have been audited, and this does include the greenhouse facility and 2 aquaponic facilities, is $675. The average out-of-pocket cost after the cost share is around $169. These costs can be mitigated by scheduling an audit at the same time as a neighboring farm to split travel time and costs. That's something that I can do because I have a list of farmers that are going to get audited, and we can usually combine a couple audits in a day. We can combine your audit with a normal farm, a regular farm, field farm, non-greenhouse operation as well, because those auditors will do both. Preparing your food safety plan in the order of the auditor's checklist is also something that I have all my farmers do so that the auditor can run through it and not have to look for things. And then having records that are organized and readily available, again, will speed things up. The Cultivate Kentucky program is, on one side, a GAP audit assistance program, and on the other side, it's connecting growers and giving them the resources they need to sell into wholesale markets. Our GAP audit assistance program is statewide. It's essentially what I'm the technical assistance provider for that. I help with food safety plan development. That really is the biggest lift for getting a GAP audit, and that really is only a big lift in the first year. You can develop your food safety plan to match your operation. Very few things are set in stone with a GAP audit. It's all about assessing your risks and how to prevent them. Record keeping templates, logs, food safety plan templates are out there, and we can develop them to match your operation and work for you. Then the next step is essentially implementing that stuff. This is the point where we kind of hand it off to you to instill a food safety culture in your operation. And once you're comfortable that your food safety plan and record keeping process is implemented, then we will schedule an audit. And other things I can help with are direction to other available resources in regard to food safety or wholesale market access, or any other kind of technical assistance throughout the extension network. I've worked here for 6 years. The results are that we've had 45 farms and 5 facilities that have been GAP certified in some form of GAP audit scheme since 2016. We have a 100% success rate of passing the audit the first time. That's partially due to the fact that I will be honest and blunt with you on whether or not you're ready. I don't want you to waste the money to have the auditor come out here. I don't want the auditor's time to be wasted. We just want to get you to the point where you're ready before you have the audit. And also outside of audits, I also help farmers develop food safety plans just to have a food safety plan. That way you're one step away from getting GAP audited, but I also think it's incredibly important for most operations to have some sort of food safety plan, standard operating procedures and policies around food safety. It's a way to stay organized, and it also helps instill that food safety culture in your operation. Okay, so here's my contact info. Please feel free to reach out. I'm going to leave this up here for another 15 or so seconds, just so you guys don't have to pause. And that about wraps it up. I want to thank the Controlled Environment Horticulture folks. And if you need any more information, there are some new fact sheets and there's a new website. Check it out.